I used to believe that love was something that could endure anything. When I met Lisa, it felt like I had found the one person in the world who understood me. Who would stand by me no matter what. We were young, in our 20s, with a sense of invincibility that made us think we could conquer the world. I remember when we first moved in together, the excitement of setting up our little apartment, cooking dinner together, laughing over silly things. It was simple, but it was ours. At first, everything seemed perfect. We had dreams, big ones. I had my job as a marketing coordinator, and Lisa was working an hour. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We'd go on weekend trips, save up for bigger vacations, and talk about our future like it was already set in stone. We even started talking about buying a house, maybe starting a family one day. It wasn't until things started to slip that I realized how fragile everything was. My job was the first to go. The company I had worked at for 5 years was downsizing. They gave me a severance package, but it wasn't much. I thought, okay, I'll find something else. But nothing came through. The market was tight, and I couldn't seem to land a decent interview. Bills started piling up. I didn't want to show Lisa how much it was affecting me, so I kept up the facade for as long as I could. When it finally became clear that things weren't getting better, I turned to her. Lisa, I said one evening, I need your help. Can we talk about the finances? I'm falling behind on rent, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I expected her to listen, to offer some kind of support, even if it was just a shoulder to lean on. But instead, she stared at me with this blank look, almost like she didn't recognize me. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she said something that still stings to this day. You should have planned better. You knew the job market was tough. Why didn't you save more? I'm not going to bail you out. That moment shattered something in me. It wasn't just the money, it was the coldness in her words. I thought we were a team, but I felt like I was on my own. I had never felt more alone in my life. The weeks turned into months, and my situation only got worse. It felt like I was stuck in quicksand, each day sinking deeper, while the world around me kept moving forward without pause. I'd wake up every morning with a knot in my stomach, knowing that today would bring another round of phone calls from creditors. More bills that would go unpaid. I had tried everything looking for jobs that weren't there, taking on side gigs that barely made a dent in the debt. I couldn't talk to Lisa anymore. I didn't want to. After that conversation, things shifted. I could feel the walls go up between us. Even if we didn't speak about it, I couldn't tell her how scared I was, how I felt like I was losing control. Every time I tried, she just wasn't there. She'd retreat into her own world, making plans to go out with friends or focusing on her career. It was like she had nothing to worry about, and her silence was louder than any words. The worst part was how she started treating me, like I was a failure, not in the words she spoke, but in the way she looked at me. There was a judgment there, a kind of quiet disappointment that I could never shake. The more I struggled, the less she seemed to see me as her husband, the person she once trusted. I was just someone who couldn't provide anymore. I didn't ask for much. I didn't want to be dependent on her, God knows I never did, but I just needed something. A little help, even if it was just for a few months until I got back on my feet. But when I tried to talk to her again, it felt like I was begging. I remember one evening, after a long day of failed interviews and a stack of overdue bills, I sat down beside her on the couch. Lisa, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I need help. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. Can you at least help me pay the rent this month? I'll figure out the rest. She didn't even look up from her phone. I told you before, you're going to have to figure this out on your own. I'm not carrying this weight for you. I sat there, frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me harder than any bill or debt ever could. It was a slap in the face. But what hurt more was that I couldn't even be angry at her. I wasn't angry, just ashamed. It felt like she had already given up on me, and I was just too blind to see it until now. I couldn't look her in the eyes anymore, not without feeling like I had failed her, failed myself. The strain of it all was eating at me, and I was getting desperate. I took on even more side jobs, worked long nights, skipped meals, and never asked for a moment to rest. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't getting ahead, and the constant pressure felt like a weight I couldn't shake off. My health started to suffer. I was exhausted all the time, emotionally drained, and my body seemed to betray me with each passing day. Lisa, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. She would come home after a long day at work, talking about her latest promotion or a new project she was working on. And I would listen, nodding like everything was fine, when in reality, I felt invisible. It was like I wasn't even a part of her life anymore. She had her own world, and I was just a spectator. I remember one day, I was lying awake in bed. The room dark except for the soft glow of the streetlight outside the window. My mind was racing. How did I get here? How did we get here? All those years of building this life together. And now it felt like it was crumbling, piece by piece. While I stood by, powerless to stop it, I wanted to scream, but there was no one to scream at. No one who would understand. No one who would care. I woke up one morning, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of the world pressing on me. But it wasn't because things had gotten better. In fact, they'd gotten worse. I had just come to a place of numbness, where it felt like I had run out of tears to cry, out of words to say. There was nothing left to do but exist in the silence that had taken over our home. Lisa was still getting up early, getting dressed for work, and going through her routine like nothing had changed. But I could tell, even from the way she moved around the house, that something had shifted. There was no warmth in the way she kissed me goodbye, no genuine interest in how I was doing. I didn't blame her, not entirely. I knew she had her own stresses to deal with, her own pressures at work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was invisible to her now. I felt like I was nothing more than a burden, a shadow in her life that she was too tired to acknowledge. The more I tried to hold it together, the more I realized how little was left to hold on to. It wasn't just the money anymore, it was everything. I had become so consumed by my inability to provide that I had lost sight of who I was. I had stopped being the person I was when we first met, the guy who could make her laugh, who had dreams and aspirations. Now, I was just someone who sat on the sidelines of my own life, watching as everything fell apart. And the worst part was that Lisa didn't even seem to notice. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was like she had stopped seeing me as the person she once loved. She couldn't see the exhaustion in my eyes, the way I barely slept anymore. She didn't hear the frustration in my voice when I told her I couldn't keep going like this. It was like I was speaking a different language, and she had stopped learning it. One night, after another long day of working 3 jobs and still feeling like I was getting nowhere, I sat down on the couch in the living room. Lisa was in the kitchen, making herself a cup of tea. She didn't ask me how my day went. She didn't ask if I needed anything. I had asked her for help so many times before, and each time, it was like I was asking for the impossible. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just fighting for our marriage anymore. I was fighting for a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. And I wasn't sure I even wanted to find him again. All I had now was this constant feeling of drowning, of trying so hard to keep my head above water, only to feel the waves pull me under time and time again. I stood up from the couch and walked to the bedroom. I didn't even look at Lisa as I passed her. I couldn't. I had reached a point where I didn't know how much longer I could pretend everything was fine. I stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the man I had been a year ago. I was older, worn down by the weight of unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. I had lost my confidence, my self-worth, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure I could ever get it back. I remember thinking, I'm done, not with life, not with everything, but with this, with us. This wasn't the relationship I had signed up for. This wasn't what we had promised each other when we first got married. I had spent too much time in a relationship where I was constantly trying to fix everything, trying to make things work, while it felt like Lisa was just watching me fall apart. The realization wasn't sudden. It didn't come in a flash of clarity. It was more like a slow burn. The kind of thing that happens when you wake up one day and finally admit that the love you thought was unbreakable has already cracked. That the person you thought would always be there has become a stranger to you. I had nothing left to give. That night, after Lisa had gone to bed, I stayed up late, pacing around the apartment, replaying everything in my head. I thought about what would happen if I left. Would she even care? Would she even notice? Or would I just be another casualty in the long list of things that had gone wrong in my life? I thought about the divorce papers. I thought about how hard it would be to walk away from someone I had loved so deeply. Someone who had once been my partner in everything. But then I thought about how much harder it was to keep pretending. To keep living in this house where the only thing that seemed alive was the bitterness between us. I picked up my phone and started drafting the email. I wasn't sure what I was expecting from it. A sense of relief, a sense of finality, maybe, but most of all, I just wanted to feel like I was doing something, anything that wasn't just drowning in silence. I didn't send it that night, but the decision was already made. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a relationship that had already ended in every way but the legal one. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. Every day, I woke up with that same sick feeling in my stomach, the same sense of dread. Only now, I was no longer pretending that things could get better. I had accepted the truth that Lisa and I were no longer on the same path. We weren't partners anymore, we were strangers living in the same space. The decision to file for divorce wasn't one I made lightly. In fact, it had been the hardest choice I'd ever had to face. I had spent so many nights awake, going over the same thought over and over again in my head. I loved her, I really did, I thought I always would. But there was no love left in our marriage. Not the kind that mattered. Not the kind that was built on mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Lisa had become a shadow in my life. Someone I once adored, now just a person who walked through the house without a word of acknowledgement. I didn't know when it happened or where it all went wrong. There had been no specific moment where I could pinpoint the downfall of our marriage. It wasn't one betrayal, one huge argument, it was a slow erosion. 1,000 little cuts that eventually bled us dry. I kept waiting for something to change. For her to see how much I was struggling. For her to offer help or even a comforting word. But she never did, and that's when I realized I was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Every conversation we had felt like a performance. I would try to talk to her about my job search, about the bills piling up, and she'd listen, but it was like she wasn't really hearing me. She would nod, say, "It'll get better," or, "I'm sure something will come through." But the way she said it, distant, disconnected, it was as though my struggles weren't even worth her time. I spent hours at night reflecting on my life, on the man I had become. I wasn't the man I used to be. I wasn't the man who laughed easily, who had ambition and dreams. I was a shell, just going through the motions, trying to stay afloat. I realized I had been living for her for so long that I had forgotten how to live for myself. It was the night after another one of our pointless arguments that I finally came to a conclusion. Lisa had come home late, as usual, and she barely even looked at me when she walked through the door. I sat on the couch, staring at the TV, pretending to care about the show playing in front of me, but all I could think about was the hollow space between us. "I can't keep doing this," I said, not even looking at her. "Doing what?" she replied coldly, almost as if she was tired of hearing it. "It's been months, Mark. You know it's not going to magically get better." Her words stung, but what hurt more was how numb they felt. It wasn't even anger anymore, it was resignation. I knew that, deep down, we were both done. We were just too afraid to admit it. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the dark for hours, just thinking. I thought about what the future would look like. I thought about what would happen if I stayed. I thought about whether it was worth trying to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. And then, for the first time in a long time, I thought about myself. What did I want? What was my future? The answer came slowly, like a whisper I'd been ignoring for months. I wanted peace. I wanted to stop pretending. I wanted to take control of my life again, even if that meant walking away from the one person who had once meant everything to me. I didn't want a messy divorce. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to argue or dredge up all the hurt and disappointment. I just wanted to end it quietly, respectfully, and start over. So, I did it. I filed for divorce. The decision felt like a weight had been lifted, but it wasn't a relief. It was more like the exhaustion of carrying a burden for so long and finally setting it down. It wasn't a victory, it was just the end of a long road I couldn't walk anymore. I didn't tell Lisa immediately. I wasn't sure how to. Part of me was afraid of her reaction, of what she might say. But a bigger part of me was already done. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Nothing left to fix. I was tired of waiting for something to change. Tired of hoping she would notice me again. Tired of living in a house where every corner held the echoes of a love that had faded. So, I made the call to my lawyer. I filled out the paperwork, signed it, and mailed it off. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big speeches. No tear-filled conversations. It just was. And that was when I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I didn't hear from Lisa about the divorce papers for a few days. At first, I thought she hadn't even noticed. That maybe she was too caught up in her own world to realize what had happened. I almost hoped that would be the case, that she'd just accept it, walk away, and move on with her life while I did the same. No arguments, no drama. But of course, that wasn't how things went. It was a Saturday morning when she finally spoke up. I was in the living room, scrolling through job listings, still searching for any sign of a way out of this mess. My phone rang. It was Lisa's name on the screen. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I debated whether or not to answer. It was early, she was probably just calling about something trivial, like dinner plans or her day, but I knew that couldn't be it. I answered the phone, my voice cautious. "Hey," I said. "Mark," she said, her tone flat, almost cold. "We need to talk." A wave of anxiety rushed over me, but I didn't let it show. "About what?" She paused for a moment. "About the divorce." I didn't say anything right away. There was no need. We both knew what this was about. The silence hung heavy between us, stretching longer than I expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. The question laced with something I couldn't quite place: hurt, disbelief, maybe even anger. Why didn't you talk to me first? I exhaled slowly, leaning back into the couch. I wasn't angry, not really. I was past that. I was just tired. Tired of the pretense. Tired of the endless waiting. Of the invisible walls we'd built between us. I didn't think talking would change anything. I said quietly, I haven't felt like we were on the same page for a long time. Lisa, I've been trying to make this work, but it just isn't. You haven't been there for me, and I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. Heavy with emotion, she didn't speak at first, and for a moment, I wondered if she had hung up. But then she finally spoke. Her voice quieter now, almost lost. Mark, she said softly, I don't know what happened to us. I don't understand. You were everything to me. And now, this. Why didn't you tell me you were struggling? It was as though the walls between us had started to crumble. Just a little. Her voice cracked on the last word. And I could hear it, the hurt. The confusion. It wasn't the same coldness from before. This was raw, real pain. I tried, I said, my voice growing firmer. I tried over and over again to reach out to you. But you weren't there. I needed you, Lisa, but you shut me out. You gave up on me long before I gave up on us. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her words were slower, more deliberate. I didn't know, she said. I didn't know you felt that way. I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing everything right. You always told me you didn't want to depend on me, that you could handle it yourself. I believed you. Her words stung, but I understood them. She had been trying in her own way. She had been focused on her career, on her own success, and she had thought that as long as she kept moving forward, everything would fall into place. But what she didn't realize was that while she was climbing, I was sinking and there was no one to catch me. I didn't want to depend on you, I said, my voice steady now, but I needed you. I needed your support, your help. I needed you to see that I was drowning, but you were too busy to notice. Another silence fell between us. This time, it felt heavier, like the weight of the years between us had become too much to carry. I could hear Lisa's breathing, the soft sound of her trying to collect herself. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't want this. I didn't want us to end like this. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I didn't want it to end like this either. I had hoped for something different. Some magical solution where we both came together and worked it out. But it had become clear that there was no magic left. No easy fix. Our marriage had crumbled, bit by bit, and no amount of talking or wishing could change that. I'm sorry, I said, the words feeling heavier than I expected. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it isn't. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her heart breaking on the other side of the line. I wanted to reach through the phone, take her in my arms, and tell her everything would be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be. For both of us, it was already over. I'll sign the papers, she said, her voice soft and resigned. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Thank you. We said our goodbyes quietly, without fanfare. There were no tears, no dramatic final words. It was just an end, as quiet as the beginning of our marriage had been. And as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sorrow. In the end, I realized that sometimes, the hardest thing to do isn't walking away, it's accepting that it's time to let go. The days following the divorce were a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. I felt like I had just shed a heavy, suffocating weight, yet the space I had once shared with Lisa felt emptier than I could have ever imagined. I had spent so much time wishing for the end, wanting to escape the constant tension, the unanswered questions. But now that it was over, I realized I wasn't sure who I was without her. I didn't have a roadmap for what came next. It wasn't like there was some grand revelation or sudden rush of clarity. I had simply woken up one morning to a life that was mine again. A life I had forgotten I could have. And yet, in this new space, I felt lost. The first few days, I stayed at the apartment, mostly in isolation. The silence was deafening. I missed the hum of life that used to fill the rooms, the sound of Lisa's voice. Even when it was distant, I missed the way she would leave her things around, creating little messes that made the place feel alive. But I also realized how much that constant noise had drained me. The first time I stepped outside in the daylight after the divorce, I felt like I was seeing the world with new eyes. The air smelled fresher, the sun seemed warmer. I had been so consumed by the weight of our relationship, by the pressure of keeping everything together, that I had forgotten what it felt like to just breathe, to be free. I threw myself into work. I didn't have much of a choice. Honestly, the bills still piled up, and I still needed to find my way back to a stable place. But this time, there was no pressure to keep up appearances. No need to explain to Lisa why I couldn't make ends meet. I had my own life to focus on now, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like I was in control. I started taking on freelance jobs, things that allowed me to stay busy and, more importantly, keep my mind occupied. I hadn't realized how much of my self-worth had been tied to my relationship with Lisa until I didn't have her to rely on anymore. It was like I had to build myself from scratch, piece by piece, rediscovering the parts of me that I had buried in the years of our marriage. There were still hard days, of course. There were mornings when I woke up, and the silence in the apartment was so thick that it suffocated me. I missed companionship, even if I didn't always know how to ask for it. The loneliness sometimes crept in when I least expected it, but I was learning to sit with it, to embrace the emptiness as a part of the healing process. I started spending time with old friends, people I had neglected in the past. It wasn't like I had forgotten about them, it was more that I had put everything into my marriage, thinking that would make everything better. Now, I had the space to rebuild those relationships, to remember who I was before I became Mark and Lisa. One night, a couple of months after the divorce, I ran into Emily at a bar. Emily was an old college friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. She was warm, easy to talk to, and when we sat down to catch up, I realized how much I missed simple conversations, how much I missed just being myself. It wasn't about love, or even about moving on romantically. It was about rediscovering the connection to the world outside my own head. As the weeks passed, I started to feel more like myself again. It was slow at first, like a long recovery from an illness. But the more I leaned into the freedom I had, the more I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of the past with me forever. The divorce wasn't just an end, it was also a beginning. I started going to the gym, something I hadn't done in years. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it felt good to feel strong again, to take care of myself without the pressure of anyone else's expectations. I started cooking again, really cooking, not just making quick meals to survive. I rediscovered my love for music, dusting off an old guitar I hadn't touched in years. These were the small acts of self-care that brought me back to life. Little by little, I remember one night sitting on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city. The night was cool, and there was a breeze that carried the smell of the rain that had just passed. I realized that I was okay. Not perfect, not whole, but okay. I had made it through something that felt impossible at the time. And I had survived. In that moment, I also realized something else. The divorce, as painful as it had been, had freed me. It had released me from the pressure of living a life I wasn't meant to live. It wasn't just Lisa who had changed, it was me. I had grown, I had learned, and I had learned how to live for myself again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was real, and maybe that was all I needed. Something real, something that was just for me. Just when I thought I had everything under control, life threw me a curveball I didn't see coming. It started like any other day, another freelance project, another batch of bills to pay. I had even started to feel like I was on the right track. Slowly, but surely, I was starting to find my rhythm. I was finally feeling like the man I had been before all of this started. The one with dreams and ambitions. But the past doesn't like to stay buried forever, does it? It was a Wednesday afternoon when I received the call. I wasn't expecting it. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but there was something nagging at me, pulling me to pick up the phone. Mark. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. I froze. There was a moment where everything in my life felt like it came to a screeching halt. It was Lisa. Hey, Lisa, I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. What's going on? She didn't answer right away. I could hear her breathing, the tension in the air. And then, in a quiet voice, she spoke. I know we've been through a lot, she began, her words slow and careful. But, I need to talk to you. There's something you don't know. My heart skipped a beat. What could she possibly need to tell me now? The divorce was final. We were done. I had moved on. I didn't need anything else from her. But there was something in her voice, something that made my stomach tighten. Something I couldn't ignore. What is it? I asked, my voice steady but filled with curiosity. I'm pregnant, she said, the words coming out like a confession. Time seemed to stand still. Pregnant? I couldn't process it. We had been apart for months now, and I couldn't remember the last time we had even been intimate. She was pregnant. My mind raced. How was this possible? Was it even mine? The questions piled on, but one thing stood out more than anything else. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to be part of her life again, especially not after everything we'd been through. I don't know what to do. Mark, Lisa continued, her voice breaking slightly. I need you to be here with me. I can't do this alone. I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning. The idea of becoming a father under these circumstances was almost too much to handle. The world I had worked so hard to rebuild suddenly seemed shaky and uncertain. I didn't even know where I stood with her anymore. I don't know what to say. I muttered. You're saying you want me to come back? To help you raise this child? I don't know what I'm asking for. She replied softly. I just don't want to go through this alone. I thought maybe we could try again. For the baby. The silence between us was suffocating. Every word she said felt like a weight pushing me deeper into uncertainty. I thought I was done with this life. With the broken pieces of our marriage. I thought I had moved on. But this was a whole new kind of mess. I need time to think. I said, my voice almost robotic. I can't make a decision like this right now. After a long pause, she simply said, okay, I'll give you time. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking slightly. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating. The freedom I had only just begun to enjoy seemed like it was slipping away. I spent the rest of the day lost in thought, replaying the conversation over and over again in my mind. I had built my life around the idea of moving on, of putting everything behind me. I had no space for this new complication. But how could I ignore it? How could I turn my back on something as huge as this? The next few days were a blur. I avoided her calls, but I couldn't stop thinking about the pregnancy. I even Googled the possible timelines, trying to piece together how far along she might be, when the conception could have happened. But all the information in the world couldn't prepare me for what came next. A week later, Lisa showed up at my apartment. I hadn't expected it, but there she was, standing at my door with that same look of determination she'd had when we first met. The difference now was that there was no warmth in her eyes. No affection, just a kind of quiet desperation. You need to make a decision, Mark, she said, her voice low. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. I don't know if I'm asking for too much. But I can't do this by myself. I swallowed hard, my chest tight. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many emotions bubbling to the surface. But I couldn't find the words. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that I couldn't be the one she came to for everything. I wanted to tell her that I had worked so hard to get my life back in order, that I wasn't the man she needed anymore. But all I said was, I'll help, we'll figure it out, but I don't know what this means for us, for our future. Her eyes softened, but it was clear that this wasn't a simple decision for either of us. It wasn't a happy reunion, a hopeful restart. It was just two people trying to figure out how to move forward when everything had already fallen apart. As she left, I couldn't help but feel that we were both standing at a crossroads. The life I had so carefully pieced together was now thrown into question. And I had to figure out where I stood, not just with her, but with myself. The future was as unclear as it had ever been. But one thing was certain, I wasn't done facing challenges. In many ways, this was just the beginning. The days after Lisa's visit felt like a slow-motion blur. Each morning I woke up with the weight of the decision ahead of me pressing down on my chest. Heavy and suffocating. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation we'd had. I couldn't escape the thought of our child growing inside of her. And the reality that it might be my responsibility. I told myself I had time to think, that I didn't have to rush into anything. But the truth was, the clock was ticking. Time wasn't my friend. It wasn't Lisa's friend, either. She was already 5 months along. She couldn't wait forever for me to decide if I wanted to be part of this new chapter of her life. I kept trying to get back to my routine, to focus on work, to keep my mind from wandering back to the growing pressure. But it was impossible. The thought of becoming a father at 36, after everything that had happened, felt overwhelming. Was I ready for this? Was I ready to share my life again with Lisa? To rebuild something that had already crumbled once? And what if I wasn't ready? Was I willing to walk away from my own flesh and blood? I avoided Lisa's calls for a few days, but it didn't make the questions go away. In fact, it made him louder, echoing in my head like a drumbeat. I spent hours pacing around my apartment, running through the same scenarios, the same fears. Would I regret it if I didn't step up? Would I hate myself for not being there for the child, for Lisa, or would I regret it if I did? Would I be opening myself up to more pain, to more of the same toxic relationship dynamics that had caused the marriage to fail in the first place? I remember the moment when the decision became clear. It wasn't some epiphany, some burst of insight. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was just quiet. I was sitting at my kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me, pretending to work, when I realized that I wasn't making the choice for the right reasons. I had spent weeks thinking about what I should do, but I hadn't asked myself the most important question: why was I doing this? I wasn't thinking about the future in a way that aligned with who I was becoming. I had been looking at this as an obligation, a responsibility I had to fulfill because it was expected of me. But that wasn't enough. I didn't want to be tied to something just because it was the right thing to do. I wanted to make a choice that felt authentic, That reflected the person I was becoming, not the man I had been. It was in that moment that I realized I had been looking at this all wrong. I wasn't just choosing between Lisa and the baby or walking away from them both. I was choosing between myself and the life I wanted. I was choosing between staying in the same cycle I had been stuck in, or finally, for the first time in a long time, making a decision that was for me. So, I picked up the phone. "Lisa," I said when she answered, "we need to talk." I met her at a coffee shop later that day. It was the kind of place where people whispered, and the noise of the world felt far away. I ordered a black coffee. Sitting down across from her, her face was drawn, tired, and there was a sadness in her eyes that made my chest tighten. "I've thought about it," I began. "I've thought about what this means. About what it means for both of us. But most of all, I've thought about what it means for me." She nodded slowly, her fingers curling around her cup, her eyes waiting for me to say more. "I can't do this," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I can't come back to you, to the life we had. Not for the baby, not for anything. I don't want to be stuck in the past. And I don't want to raise a child just because it's the right thing to do. I want to do this because I want to. Because I can give that child a life. But I'm not ready for that. Lisa, not with you, not in this way." The words felt like a weight falling from my chest. It was the truth, harsh as it was. But in the silence that followed, I realized it wasn't just the truth, it was the only truth I could live with. Lisa's expression didn't change much, but I saw the tension leave her body. She didn't look angry, not like I thought she would. She just looked defeated. And for the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt like I could breathe again. "I understand," she said quietly, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. "I really do. I didn't expect you to come back. I didn't think you would. But I thought maybe this was our second chance. We don't get second chances." "Lisa," I replied, my voice softer now, "we've already tried, and I can't go back to a life I walked away from for a reason." There was a long pause as Lisa looked down at her coffee. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry, she simply nodded. "I guess this is it, then," she said, almost to herself. I stood up, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to say, but it was also the right one. We had both been holding on to a life that didn't fit us anymore. And by finally letting go, we could both find something better, something real. "I'm sorry, Lisa," I said, the words full of regret, but also acceptance. "But this is the only way." She stood as well, brushing her hair behind her ear. "I know," she whispered. I walked out of that coffee shop, the weight of the decision finally lifting from my shoulders. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, but it was the right thing for me. For both of us. I wasn't ready to be a father, not yet. Not in this broken situation. But I wasn't going to let this decision define me either. I had made my choice. And now, I would live with it. I would move forward. In that moment, I understood something. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is not to fix the broken pieces, but to walk away from them. To know when it's time to start fresh. To give yourself the chance to rebuild, not because you're obligated, but because you deserve a life that's yours. Truly yours.